In 1775, Thomas Paine wrote a pamphlet stating that the freedoms of men can only be maintained by limiting the power of government. The pamphlet was called Common Sense, and today it still is common sense.
I'm Mark Zaccaria.
I'm April Giarrusso. This is Common Sense. Welcome back. Do you get the feeling the Rhode Island government, at all levels, is structured so that insiders get preference for pretty much everything? If you do, you'll have those fears confirmed as we take a closer look at the isolation of the powerful in our General Assembly and how that works against all the rest of us. We'll also shine a light on the latest attempt at sleight of hand in the budgeting process in the City of Providence. We will also commiserate with you over the appearance that the rookies always seem to be put into the game up on Smith Hill. Later, State Representative Patricia Morgan conducts a follow-up interview with Mike Cerullo. He's the former East Greenwich Town Council member who is now heading up a coalition opposed to relaxing anti-marijuana legislation too quickly. This time around, they will concentrate on the recreational use of the drug. Between segments of that discussion, Mark and I will certainly pop back in to pose the satiric question of the day. Are you kidding me? Finally, we will look to the words of wisdom from Port Smith's own Jeff Richard. This week, Jeff turns his attention to labor statistics. We have a power-packed show for you this week. So let's get things started. Mark?
Thanks, April. Last week, we witnessed the sudden demise of longtime Rhode Island Representative Ray Gallison. Just 2 weeks before his abrupt resignation from the chamber, Common Sense took satiric note of the gentleman's angry response to a form letter, using a form letter of his own in reply. 2 months ago, during the truck toll debate, a more sinister-looking Rep. Gallison was seen on tape threatening his colleague, our own Representative Patricia Morgan. On that occasion, Gallison was chairing a meeting of his House Finance Committee when he'd had enough of Rep. Morgan's suggestions that a simple reallocation of existing appropriations could fund the proposed needs for road and bridge repair without requiring new state borrowing. He famously and discourteously shouted her down and demanded the clerk make her microphone inoperative. Now, beneath a shroud of secrecy as to the details of Mr. Gallison's recent behavior, it appears he's about to take the perp walk. While gossips and wags might want to savor the delicious details of his alleged sins, I take another approach to what seems to have just happened. Mr. Gallison is a public figure whose elevation to committee chair got commentator Dan York right up off his seat when he heard that news 2 years ago. York was moved to castigate then brand new Speaker Nick Mattiello at length for his choice of a lightweight for this important role. But what of the effect of all of that on Rep. Gallison himself? It seems he withdrew from regular contact with anyone who might be a critic. In the absence of criticism and within his Smith Hill cocoon, he might even have begun to think of himself as the master of all he surveyed, rather than as the servant of the people he was elected to be. If he did, Ray Gallison is not alone in that transformation from ordinary citizen to leadership grandee. William Irons did the same thing before he was called to account by the Ethics Commission. In the Irons case, though, he was able to convince a judge that all legislators are outside that jurisdiction. Gordon Fox did the same thing when he began using cash from what some would call shakedowns for personal expenses. Does anyone remember the case of Senator John Salona? You know I could go on. Folks, what we have in the General Assembly today is a collection of small-time empire builders who have failed to learn the simple lesson that the more you become master, the more you become servant. Ray Gallison is by no means the only member to have made that mistake. He may not be the only member to have done so recently in a felonious manner. He's just the latest in a circus parade of perps leaving the legislature. No one should doubt this analysis. The Gallison situation is not an isolated incident. The only way to put a stop to more of this kind of behavior is to have a real game of musical chairs come Election Day. Unless an elected official feels pressure from their constituents, it is way too easy for them to settle in for an isolated, lifetime ride. Remember that in November. April?
Thanks, Mark. Providence Mayor Jorge Elorza unveiled his $717 million fiscal year 2017 budget proposal, which, according to Elorza, focuses on the long term. Go Local Prov doesn't seem to agree. and critics question whether it actually does address long-term structural issues. In case you've forgotten, that includes a budget deficit that is projected to balloon over 1,100% in 10 years. This proposal included investments in education, infrastructure, and an increased car tax exemption, made possible partially because of a $13 million property tax expansion. Elorza noted that he would be working with groups to identify new revenue streams, meeting with unions to tackle the city's pension obligation, and working with nonprofits over taxes. But it is important to note that those goals are not reflected in this upcoming budgeted year's proposal. Here's how some of the mayor's plans break down. In terms of taxes, this proposal looks to reduce the commercial tax rate by 1% and increase the commercial property tax values by 7%. But Providence already has some of the highest commercial property taxes in the country. So how exactly does that make us look more attractive to incoming businesses? Gary Sass, former director of the Rhode Island Department of Administration and Rhode Island Public Expenditure Council, noted that this particular policy will conflict with other state and local programs that are aimed at incentivizing development. So taxes are being reduced by a few percent. Sounds great. But property values are being raised to offset those reductions. So what's going on here? And if you're thinking, well, April, I don't own anything, I'm a renter, so anything to do with property tax has no effect on me. Well, I'd say you're wrong. Super wrong. Because you probably do own a car. Now, that car tax exemption might benefit you in that respect. But the city will make it back, and then some, because your rent is going to be increased to cover the change in property taxes. And what if you don't own a car? Well, then I guess you get no benefits. That might be an over-exaggeration, but only time will tell if this new budget proposal is approved or amended to actually suit the needs of the people of Providence. Mark?
Thanks again, April. Listen, you don't have to play in the big leagues to understand that you've got no one to blame but yourself when you whiff on an easy pitch because you had your mind on extra bases instead of just making contact. Come on, you know how that works. You see a tater coming, and instead of staying on it, you take a peek at the opposite field to see if you can be a hero. In that moment of distraction, what happens? Disaster. You fail to convert on what should have been an easy at-bat. Okay, what's any of this got to do with governing Rhode Island? Well, last week in her Go Local Prov column, Kate Nagel published a laundry list of unforced errors made by the Raimondo administration in its first 18 months at the helm. Each one of them was only a small to medium embarrassment, but taken together, they become a trail of screw-ups. Here they are. The Cianci flag lowering. First she left it up to offend his supporters. Then she lowered it to offend his detractors. So no one was happy. Then there was the Davos trip, courtesy of the URI Foundation. Fail. That brought up the question of the Rhode Island College Foundation covering the entire cost of Rhodey's new Chief Innovation Officer and his staff and office space. Epic fail. So far, you could have cackled at the humorous ineptitude. But next came the report on the deaths of children while in DCYF care. Ouch. How about the endless drumbeat of new public relations initiatives being made by the suddenly pumped-up gubernatorial madmen staff? We still haven't heard how all that new, unbudgeted payroll is going to be covered, but we've certainly heard about Gina from Fortune, Glamour, People, and Clinton campaign manager John Podesta. Okay, what more could be said about truck tolls? Maybe just this. Huh? Cooler and warmer? Clinton's primary numbers? How about Point Judith Capital LLC losing all that pension money? Hey, who owns that company anyways? I don't care what kind of a hotshot you think you are in the batter's box. If you goof up that badly, some big, ugly hitting coach is going to take you aside for a little bit of humiliation and a lot of remedial BP. Who's going to do that for the governor, though? If she keeps playing this inning while thinking about the position she might have in the World Series, she's going to find herself sent down to Pawtucket, if, in fact, the Red Sox are still there. Heads up, rookie. Keep your mind in this ball game, or you'll never get that call-up to the bigs. April?
Thanks, Mark. That's it for our dissection of the news this week. So stand by for the first segment of Representative Pat Morgan's interview. Before we get to that, though, let's recap what's ahead on this edition of Common Sense, and maybe even ask the rhetorical question, are you kidding me? Probably the biggest story of the past few weeks has been the abrupt retreat of Representative Raymond Gallison and the state and federal investigations he is facing. I'd love to be flippant and say something like, corrupt politician isn't an oxymoron in Rhode Island. But if you're like me, then you're just plain desensitized to all this bull. And that might be the big issue here. Are you kidding me? Rep. Gallison has served as a Democratic state representative since 2006 and was on all accounts one of Rhodey's pride and joys, even becoming the chief marshal of Bristol's famous 4th of July parade last year. He was the chair of the House Finance Committee before resigning his seat last week. And I don't just mean as the chair of that committee. He resigned his legislative seat, which means you know big trouble's coming. Reports flooded in that he is in the center of an investigation linked to ethics violations and even prostitution, as the Providence Journal reports. And this isn't even his first rodeo. In 2007, the State Ethics Commission accused him of violating ethics laws by failing to disclose more than $100,000 he has received over 3 years in the form of community grant money directed toward Alternative Educational Programming LLC, or AEP. He settled and paid a fine of $6,000 for failing to disclose his employment with the legislatively financed program. And yet, he continued to be an elected official. This is another in a long line of corrupt politicians in our state. I mean, it wasn't that long ago that Gordon Fox's house was being raided and he was changing his address to a federal prison. You'd think that after years of abuse by some elected officials, this state would get wise. The voters would get vocal, and the checks and balances to avoid such abuses would be in full force. But they're not. And guess what? That's on us. We are seeing evidence of abuse like Mr. Gallison's 2007 violation, and we are not doing anything to correct the behavior. I bet when the news broke and you were reading the Providence Journal, probably online, you started laughing because these zany politicians who think they can get away with anything, well, they can. Because all you're doing is laughing and shaking your head at them the way that you would when a toddler takes markers to the living room wall. We are the ones who are hurt by these scandals, not just because it shakes up our entire government potentially to its deepest levels, but come on, people, take some pride in your state. Cut down the abusers, the liars, the impotent, and bring up some leadership that's not only going to show some backbone, but also not get arrested in the process. And to all you elected officials who are considering shady behavior, let me help you out. Let me give you Projo's Edward Fitzpatrick's top 10 ways for RI lawmakers to stay out of prison. 1. Don't touch a dime that doesn't belong to you. 2. Be humble. 3. Earn your money. 4. Pick up your own tab. 5. Don't do anything you wouldn't want to see on the front page of Projo. 6. Pick the right State House mentor. 7. Don't splurge on the fancy items like a new Audi. Reference recommendation number 2 and be humble. Don't avoid conflict, but do avoid conflicts of interest. 9. Don't mistake the State House for the Hotel California. And 10. Don't be the guy who knows a guy. I'm going to make it even simpler for you, so listen up. Come closer. Come here. Come here. Let's get real intimate right now. You're going to want to remember this. Don't be stupid. Don't be stupid. I'm not saying don't get caught. I mean just don't do it. If it's stupid, don't do it. If it's corrupt, don't do it. How hard is that? How hard can it possibly be to just do your job for the state of Rhode Island? Are you kidding me? Hey, you know the drill. Step away from that remote. There's plenty more common sense still ahead on this week's broadcast. Get ready for Pat Morgan's in-depth interview with Mike Cerullo. It's all about the downside risk of making recreational marijuana use legal here in the Ocean State. Do you have a taste for some political satire? Well, that's good, because Mark and I have a number of tasty tidbits all ready to serve in that department as we ask, are you kidding me? Tidying up all the loose ends will be Portsmouth pundit Jeff Richard. He'll close things out with words of wit and wisdom this week on labor statistics. So stay tuned and stay informed. It's Common Sense TV.
Welcome to Common Sense Rhode Island. This is a program where we try to make sense out of the policies that affect your life and come up with common sense solutions. I'm Representative Patricia Morgan, and we have with us today Mike Cerullo, who is a therapist and has been very involved in a What's Your Rush Rhode Island movement. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for coming.
It's always good to see you.
Yeah, it really is good. The last time you were here, you talked about medical marijuana and some of the issues around regulating it and making sure that it's a healthy and safe product for people who need it as medication. But today we're going to talk about recreational marijuana.
Oh.
Okay?
You want to go down to the no controversy area, right?
There are no controversy, that's right. You know, it appears that there is the leadership, the governor and the speaker, want to put it on the ballot, non-binding referendum about whether people want recreational marijuana to be legalized or not. I think it's cynical. I think they want to drive young people to the polls so that they can get more Democrat votes. That being said, we may have a referendum, and I'm not sure that all of the information is out there. You know, a lot of information about, oh, look at how much money we'll get, and oh, we're going to be behind Massachusetts, but not a lot of other information about what's happening in other states that have already legalized it. But let's start with Massachusetts.
Okay.
Right? It appears they want to put it on their ballot in the fall.
Right.
It would be a binding referendum at that point.
In Massachusetts, if it gets to a binding referendum, I've just received notification that there's a challenge in the Supreme Court about the way it's been framed. And in fact, I was asked, among other people, to become an amicus curiae, to be a friend of the court on this. So what's the rush as part of that conversation in a small way.
So it may not get on the ballot?
Well, there's that possibility. You know, Governor Baker and it's a bipartisan movement called the Safe and Healthy Massachusetts.com people are out there doing what we try to do, and that's to debunk the disinformation that's out there about what's going on. And they have an active group out there right now moving away from this notion that everyone is interested in having recreational use for marijuana. That's part of the disinformation that's out there. So the proponents are always saying that there are three pieces to their platform. It's all they've got, really. One is that prohibition is a failed policy. However, there's absolutely no credible evidence out there that says that legalization would be any more effective than the current way we regulate marijuana. In fact, there's a lot of evidence from places like Colorado that are saying it's not been better, it's been less effective, but that's...
So let me stop you there and explore that a little bit more. So it's a failed policy in that people are still getting marijuana, they're still getting illegal drugs.
Right.
Right, isn't that what they're saying? That, you know, yes, they're not going to a store and buying it, but they are still buying it.
Correct. They're getting it from illegal, youth are getting it illegally through what's called the gray market, where legal friends go buy it and then they give it to them. Just another form of the black market, but it's replaced parts of the black market.
Yeah, they're not going to a street corner.
But the real point is that there's been increases in usage, there's been increases in traffic fatalities related to marijuana, even just marijuana alone.
You mean in the states that have legalized it?
In the states that have legalized it, as well as many of the states that have not legalized it but have medical marijuana programs, depending on how well they're framed. But when you go back to the principle that there's a lot of money to be made, as well as this notion that prohibition is a failed policy, there's no support there. Nobody has done what we call for, which is a very detailed fiscal analysis, a fiscal note on the proposals, the various proposals that are out there. No one's done any cost analysis for downstream public health costs. No one's identified the regulatory costs. For example, at the AG conference a couple of weeks ago, some folks from Colorado reported that they started out with 15 FTEs to regulate the
full-time employees.
And now, full-time employee, this year's budget, they've already increased it with a supplemental to 70. Now there's 115, I believe.
Oh my God,
in the budget. That's a
increase.
Tenfold increase. And we don't even have an FTE assigned to medical marijuana alone here. They're not making.
Sure, I think is there even one whole person in the
No,
Department
they're
of
not.
Health? There is not.
They are hijacking the very people who are responsible for licensing and monitoring doctors, barbers, myself, and other therapists. That is not the priority for the people who are currently assigned to getting medical marijuana licenses. Medical marijuana licenses have become the priority because of the way the General Assembly framed the legislation initially, in terms of how quickly you have to approve a medical marijuana card. So, prohibition, well, prohibition so far appears to be more effective than legalization
Because it really
out
did
there.
hold down the growth.
It does.
Of
It
problems.
does. It controls
It
it.
does,
If you take a look at the 10 most used, the most recent numbers on the 10 states that are at the top of the list, way above the national average for last month reported use by adolescents and college-age students, you'll find that all 10 of them are either legalized states or medical marijuana states or decriminalized states, whereas the 10 lowest don't have any of those. That is clearly
All right, so
an indication
hang on.
that legalization
So, in the
isn't...
states that have legalized it, decriminalized it, or put in medical marijuana, you have a higher number of adolescents, college kids,
Reporting,
adults
right.
using marijuana.
So let's use a specific 2 examples. The national rate for adolescents, 12 to 17, is 7.22% for the last 2 years
National
reported.
average, all right,
National average.
7.25%.
Right. In Colorado, it's 12.56. In Rhode Island, it's 10.69. In the top 10, California happens to be at the bottom at 8.74%.
Okay.
All 4 legalized states are substantially above that.
Higher usage.
Higher usage. And the college student rate is even higher. And
And so those that,
that's a big problem.
so the ones at the bottom do not have legalized
No,
marijuana.
4.9%.
And they're between 4 and 5%, about
5%,
5%.
very, very, very low compared to the other. Well, if legalization is a better policy, a more effective policy, why is that number going up?
Well, the thing is that it's a failed policy. That debunks
No,
that.
legalization
Because where
may...
it's legalized, it is exploding the usage, and where it's not legalized, it's
Yeah.
being held in check.
And so the proponents will say, well, we need time. We agree. What's the rush? Let's find out what happens over the course of 5 or 6 years, which is what the Rand Corporation recommended.
Well,
When-
and I'll be honest with
Yeah.
you, if we're thinking about the health and mental effects of drug usage, and marijuana is a drug, right? It changes your brain. Then maybe we want to keep it down until we find out what the effects are. But listen, we're going to
Sure.
take a break right now,
Okay?
and we're going to come right back. There's more to talk about.
Rhode Islanders are a generous lot. For instance, we just love offering newbies on-the-job training to get them up to speed. That's why the average tenure of a sitting state legislature is well over 10 years. It takes time to get all those startup jitters out of your system. Still, it's always a moment of pride when one of the new kids on the block finally starts catching on to the finer points of his or her new gig. We may actually have seen that last week from our own General Treasurer, Seth Magaziner. Are you kidding me? Well, I do have tongue-in-cheek on this one, so maybe he hasn't gotten it all down just yet. He did show the first signs of recognition of his position just last week, though. As Mike Riley reported in his column in Go Local Prov, the General Treasurer has been oblivious thus far in his term to the fact that he hasn't earned a dime for the state pension fund, which is his primary responsibility. He has been trying to calm all fears of an impending shortfall in the fund by repeating the mantra that all it takes is 7.5% interest, compounded for 30 years, and that just brings the fund to 80% of whole. That actual growth has been a negative value for his entire term in office so far seems to have eluded him, at least until now. This week, we can all start beaming like proud parents who look on it as their youngster rides a two-wheeler for the first time. This week, the light bulb of recognition went on above Seth Magaziner's head. How do we know that? Why, because it was this week that he began blaming his predecessor for all the problems of the Rhode Island Pension Fund. So, yes, that immediate predecessor is now the sitting governor. But that just means he's still got some OJT in front of him when it comes to politics. For now, though, our budding state finance chief has thrown his first sacrificial lamb under the bus. Aren't you proud? Or, to put it another way, are you kidding me?
Welcome back to Common Sense Rhode Island. I'm Representative Patricia Morgan, and today we have with us Mike Cerullo, who is a family therapist who has worked with a lot of people who have been involved with addictions.
No question. When you work with men and you work with young men, adolescents, you're definitely working with families. And I see a lot of young people and families who are impacted by drugs of all kinds. And they play a really significant and very disruptive role in the family system, as well as in the lives of the individual who's struggling with the substances.
Yeah, you know, I ought to be upfront about this, though I'm always willing to learn more and see if I can change my mind. I think we need to wait and find out what the effects are, but I have seen so much devastation in my life from the use of, yes, just marijuana.
Sure.
Because people say, oh, no, marijuana is safe and no harm comes from it. I have personally seen lives destroyed with it. And for me, it's, I cannot go down a road if I know lives, and more than just one life, many lives
Right.
are going to be destroyed and badly impacted by it. Maybe Colorado and Oregon and all those, they'll come up with the better solution, but until they do, it's really hard for me to sign on. But I know you working with families, you've seen it too.
Sure. And, you know, Dr. John Femino, who is former president of the American Society of Addiction Medicine, describes what's going on with marijuana as just another addition to what he calls the addiction sales industry's way of promoting addiction and supporting addiction.
Yeah, I imagine if you're selling a project, it's great for you if the people are addicted to it.
Sure, the NIH.
You've got a ready-made
Right.
customer.
Right, in the, exactly.
Consistent.
Exactly. In fact, at the NIH summit that I attended last month with 40 major researchers from throughout the country, one of the presentations was from a 35-year veteran of the tobacco wars. You know, you remember when we were trying so hard to get the tobacco industry to become responsible. And what he said was that we need to be very much aware. Okay, I'm going to read you the quote. It's a very powerful quote, a very brief one, but I think it's important to understand the stakes in this, especially in terms of the timing. So he says, policymakers and public health advocates must be aware that the tobacco industry or comparable multinational organizations, for example, food and beverage industries, are prepared to enter the market with intention of increasing its already widespread use.
Oh,
Now,
really? So
well,
it would
you're not going to
substitute-
believe this, but this morning's New York Times
Yeah.
has a report in it of a major advertising agency partnering with a major media, one of the newspapers that are selling marijuana, and they produced a report called Rebranding Marijuana. And the entire purpose of this is to frame how these companies are now moving into it Here are some of the...
So it will be the new tobacco?
Absolutely, the
the
new tobacco.
Cigarette, go into the 7-Eleven and pick up a pack.
They're already talking about how the alcohol people are getting into it. And the problem there is that everybody is talking about, well, marijuana is less of a problem than alcohol, and it also is going to be a substitute for alcohol. Well, that's not the way things are going. They're selling more alcohol in Colorado, and now the alcohol people are marrying it. They're into the promotion of and advertising in marijuana publications.
So let me ask you about that.
Sure.
You said the use of alcohol is going up as
Mm-hmm.
the marijuana is going up. Do they work together? I mean, people smoke and drink at
Oh,
the same time?
absolutely.
Is that the idea?
Absolutely,
They
and we know that,
augment one
and
another?
at the scientific level, another presentation at this NIH summit talked about the combination of the two simultaneously. There's two ways to think about it, either simultaneously or sometimes you use marijuana and sometimes you use alcohol. Well, that's one of the reasons sales, just the first year of legalization of alcohol, went up 4%, okay? You're not going to get any public health savings if alcohol is increasing. So what happens here?
Is there a scientific link? I mean, so once you start smoking marijuana,
Right.
you also want to have alcohol, or when you're not high, you want to have a drink kind of thing?
Well,
Kind
that's
keep
part of
your
what, that's
system
part,
altered all the time?
that's part of what they're trying to sell. You know, I used to be a marketing guy back in the Mad Men days and worked with
Never come down?
Madison
I'm sorry.
Madison Avenue's approach. But what's going on now is that they're trying to sell lifestyles and cultures. They talk about it becoming a lifestyle ingredient in the beauty, food, and fashion industries. One of the advertisements had guys standing around talking, and the caption was coffee, cannabis, and clothing. This is what they're pairing and putting together in their media campaigns or their recommendations for how to approach marketing marijuana.
So a joint, jello, and jewelry?
Georgia, that was wonderful. I got to remember that. That's perfect.
Okay.
But you know, it's really important to recognize that this is about cultural transformation. Do we really want a culture that endorses this sort of thing and send that message to young people,
All right.
especially?
And
that's a big question.
That's a big question, especially if there is real damage to young minds,
Mhm.
the way they think,
Right.
or to health, to safety, right? Which is I understand they've been out in Colorado and these other states, they have been studying the effects of recreational marijuana, right? On newborn children and youth and all that kind of stuff. What have they come up with?
Well, partly, a lot of the research on pregnancy and impacts on children came from the Netherlands, some very credible stuff. Now, they've had very liberalized marijuana programs over the last 15 years or so. So one of the major studies indicates that there is a 15-ounce decrease in fetal birth weight over a 40-week gestation. Now,
That's significant.
That's huge. That's huge, and
huge.
that's just one of those things. I don't want to get into
That's a
the
pound-
numbers
a pound
thing. That's
less.
a pound less on average.
And the
I
bigger,
believe. Right.
you want a big healthy baby.
Right,
Big
and if
cheeks.
anybody's interested in looking at some of these numbers, they can go to our website, what'stherush-ri.org.
Okay.
what'stherush-ri.org. We have a great deal of information. We keep adding it every day. You can sign up and have these reports sent to you on a regular basis. But what this gentleman who'd been fighting the tobacco wars all that time said is that if you're going to legalize, you got to have a regulatory board in place from day one that cannot be controlled by the industry, and that you are in a position very quickly to issue a black box warning on the product, assuming that it is legalized. We had to fight how many years, decades, to get that with
cigarettes.
tobacco and on alcohol. Why do we not want to do that ahead of time and take our time? If these 113 people at the State House are going to make that decision, and of course I know that's not something you want to do.
I think we really do want to have all that in place before we legalize, but you know, let's talk about that a little bit more in our next segment.
Great.
Right now we're going to take a break and find out, are you kidding me?
Providence has a potential revenue stream to consider, a real one. But of course, they have to overcome the ebb and flow of critics and possibly turn the tides of public works. In case you're not catching on, they are considering privatizing the Providence water supply. Are you kidding me? This actually isn't a new idea and has been considered multiple times for at least the past 30 years. Mayor Elorza is looking for ways to address Providence's long-term financial outlook. And if you need some cash now, I guess it's not too strange an idea to sell an asset worth around $370 million. The administration feels that this could reduce its retiree liabilities significantly. On the other hand, Georgia Hollister Isman, the state director for Rhode Island Families, wants the city to know that selling the Providence Water System's assets is a non-starter for Rhode Island residents. Selling assets to balance a budget can be problematic because no matter how much the asset is worth, the option doesn't address budget shortfalls. It's kind of like putting a Band-Aid over a really deep gash. It might help, but is only good for the time it takes you to get to the hospital and get some stitches. Many local governments have been able to stabilize long-term liabilities and other pressures by monetizing a city asset. Think Indianapolis, Indiana, not Flint, Michigan. What may or may not be different in this scenario is that Providence Water is more of a state resource than just a city asset. Providence City Councilman Sam Zurier questioned the political potential of such a move, but noted that we can't rule it out at such an early stage. He said that the value of a report like this is not that we will act on the proposals tomorrow, but instead show that we're looking under every rock and sofa cushion to go after all the pennies first. Residents of Providence have already become vocal over the idea, some even going so far as to say that former and current administrations have cannibalized the city's resources to the detriment of the residents. So if this actually happens, the people of Providence really need to trust their mayor, especially when it comes to negotiating. Think they will? Are you kidding me?
Welcome back to Common Sense Rhode Island. I'm Representative Patricia Morgan, and today we have with us Mike Cerullo, who is a member of What's the Rush Rhode Island.
That's correct.
So What's the Rush-RI-org, which is an organization that's saying, hey, we don't know whether recreational marijuana is a good idea or not, but let's take our time and get it right. And I think that's where we ended our last segment. Let's get it right.
Let's get it right.
Let's
fix
find out what the dangers are to our children, to our families. Let's find out what its effects on our law enforcement agencies are,
Sure.
and just our culture, our joint jello and jewelry culture. But let's find it out. Let's take our time and make sure that we have it right. Because quite frankly, and I said it before, I've seen it destroy lives. Just marijuana, nothing more than that. And I wouldn't want to see that being compounded across our society.
Sure. You know, we were talking about alcohol and marijuana. Well, in South County, we just lost 30 jobs in a $1.2 million building because a young man was driving with both alcohol and cannabis in his system, and he drove into this building in South County Commons. 30 jobs and 1.2 million. The fortunate thing was he did not get killed in that
And he didn't
thing.
hurt anybody.
And it does destroy people's lives. It does affect people in many, many ways.
Well, I remember when we talked in the past, you said, okay, so now we know that, first of all, babies who are born from mothers who smoke during pregnancy are lower in birth rate. That's significant.
Sure it is. There's a big public health cost.
Right. It affects their brain development, their nervous system. neurologicals, all those kinds of things,
Sure.
whether they're healthy or not. I mean, instead of a 7-pound baby, you have a 6-pound baby. Or instead of 6.5, you have 5.5, which is a real danger zone, right?
Sure, another study pointed out that 50% of those babies end up in intensive care. That's a lot of money.
It's a lot, well, and it's a lot of,
It's a lot of
It's not so
problems
much
for
the
the
money,
family. It's
but
the
it's-
lost productivity. It's
it's what does that child's life become? It might be impaired as a result.
a lot of that, along with the downstream addiction that develops.
Well, I know 20 years ago, there was a crack epidemic, is that the right word for it?
Right.
And a lot of crack babies were born,
Right.
and these children were born addicted and have had severe problems as they've worked their way through the education.
Yeah. So
For
that's
schools.
absolutely.
Big, big problems. So, but, okay, so we know that that's a scientific study. More babies are being born underweight. What other effects does recreational marijuana have, say on young adolescents?
It doubles the risk of testicular cancer in adolescent boys who begin smoking marijuana in the 8th grade, 13, 14 years old. Doubles. This is solid science. It also significantly increases cardiovascular impacts, seizures, brain embolisms, strokes. There's
At a young age?
Well, in that case, yeah, I've seen cases where an adolescent with no other risk factors at 18 years old was dead within an hour and a half of being admitted to an ER, looking as if he was having a seizure. That was a study that was done in 2004, and since then there have been a progression of studies. Again, you can see them on our website, www.whatstherush-ri.org. You go to the research analysis column and you'll see all of these solid pieces of science, whether the impact is on public safety, road, highway accidents, cancer, neurological problems, ADHD, and what it does, all of the addiction concerns. So there's a lot of data, and it's a very complex issue. It's not just one little area you look at or you need to look at. You need to look at the whole picture. You got to connect the dots, and in many cases, we are still identifying the dots, not just having problems connecting it.
Because how long has it been legalized in Colorado? Just a few years?
Less than a couple of years.
Okay.
Okay.
But let me push back.
About
because
2 years.
I think a lot of the people who are in favor of legalizing marijuana are saying, well, I smoke it. You know, there's adults who have smoked it their whole lives, and they say, what's the big deal, right? I get up in the morning, I go to work, I'm fine.
Yeah.
I just like to smooth out, or whatever they say they
Sure.
want to do.
So now you got to talk about potency, and this is really huge. This was another major point that was made at the NIH summit. What we know about pot in terms of the impacts on our bodies, as well as a lot of the studies that were done on highway safety and so forth, were done when people were smoking regular pot. Now, regular pot is what the 1980s produced. 2 to 4, maybe 6%
I think it was the
THC.
70s, but we'll say 80s for you.
Thank you for saying that. So in any case, but that's regular pot.
Okay.
And then
And
there
what's
is
the
now what
potency
gets
of the regular pot? What was the potency?
2 to 4, 6%.
Okay.
THC to CBDs. CBDs are not psychoactive, and that's where all of the medical benefits, for the most part,
Comes
are
from
rooted.
CBD.
Once we do the research. We still have a lot of research to do to explain which components of marijuana. You know, the CBDs constitute 0.06% of the entire marijuana plant. There are 350 compounds there, and yet everybody in the industry is focused, including our own medical marijuana program here in Rhode Island, are focusing on the increase in the concentration of THC. So currently, in the plant form, the concentrations are ranging, and this is what they call super pot at the NIH. The concentrations are ranging up to 20-25%. Okay, that's huge of THC. So that's an order of magnitude higher.
Wow,
But
2 to 6%
right,
to 25.
I've talked with agronomists who think they can get it to 45%. Okay, now, but
So
that's not
when they're breeding
right,
it in particular.
right.
or-
That's when they do it. Now, this is the really scary part, and that's that we now have nuclear pot. What I think of as nuclear pot. Because when you start looking at the concentrates, these things like BHO, butane hash oil, they're talking 85 to 95% concentration. And the kids love this stuff. And the reason they like reading it, smoking this stuff is that, or using it, they dab it, they vape it, it can be used in a vape pen. They like it because it's odorless, they like it because it gives them a much higher high, and they like it because it gives you a faster high. And it's very
Well,
often.
It's so
And
high
it's
in
that
concentration.
concentrated.
Yeah.
And you know, at the governor's, I mean, at the AG's discussion, I met a scientist whose responsibility, he's a member of the American Chemical Society's group that's trying to identify in the concentrates, as well as the plant form, what would be acceptable levels of concentrated pesticides, because that process of concentrating the THC concentrates pesticides that may have been used. It also concentrates the benzenes that are the results of solvent extraction. That's a carcinogen. We don't have those standards established
I
yet.
know. I mean, that's just scary to me. But listen, on that note, I know there's more you want to say, and we will say it in just a few minutes.
To quote American troubadour and philosopher Willie Nelson, last week Rhode Island Governor Gina Raimondo was on the road again. There's no word as of airtime whether her trip was paid for by Alex and Ani, the Iggy's Clam Cake Foundation, Autocrat Syrup, or some consortium of New York hedge funds and Johnny Cake diners. What is certain is that her destination was San Francisco, California, en route to Silicon Valley. Governor Raimondo's objective for this safari? Why, to bag a couple high-tech companies to move their major operations to the ocean state and thereby relieve us of all our woes. Wait, what? Are you kidding me? Actually, I think so, but only time will tell. It was said down at TF Green Airport that she departed in a vintage open cockpit biplane named Rocinante. With her was her trusty sidekick, Stefan Pryor, once again playing Sancho Panza to her Don Q. There is plenty in the story of this quest that the famed new bevy of PR flacks now infesting the State House can use as grist for their mill. As to what the Yahoos, Googles, Intels, and Apples of that mystical and far-off land might actually get from listening to Little Rhodey's pitch, well, that's somewhat in doubt. Who cares? When you're on such a quest, there's the exciting feeling that you are only one spreadsheet away from a victory that will put the ocean state on easy street. If you could just land that one big fish, your future will be secure. Wait, no, that's the old man in the sea. I'm mixing my metaphors, sorry. The point is that it was a fantasy to think that the GE headquarters could be lured here. It was a fantasy to imagine that at Davos there would be enough rich corporate citizens so that someone could be talked into betting on Rhode Island. Don't you know that before we can find anyone to offer to buy us dinner and a movie, we have to be attractive, at least in some small way. That means getting to work here at home on a makeover. First, let's reduce just a bit. Reduce expenses, that is, so we can offer lower tax rates without going broke. Maybe we can shed a few regulations, too. Then let's primp just a bit, shall we? You know, spruce up the looks of our customer service, so dealing with the Department of Administration involves less fear and loathing. In short, let's make our state a place where money will come on its own, because it's treated well. Maybe then the governor would be able to get more out of a junket like this than just a free fundraiser and some frequent flyer miles. Think that'll happen? Are you kidding me?
Common Sense Rhode Island. I'm Representative Patricia Morgan, and we have with us today Mike Cerullo, who is a member of What's Your Rush, RI.org, and you're reading the cannabis issue here.
Well, it's actually a pretty comprehensive issue that talks about the cannabis questions from both perspectives, which is what we were all about to start with. That was our goal when we started 3 years ago, to develop a rational, evidence-based conversation on these proposals that just 113 people are going to make a decision about. And we believe we need to get that information to the decision makers.
We need to get all of the
information. We need to have a fiscal study on true costs, now and downstream. We need to, as again, at the NIH summit I attended, the very clear clarion call they made to people, to states that were early adopters of medical marijuana, which we were in 2006. And this is what the presenters said. It is essential to fix and update their statutes, regulations, and supply architectures. How it is grown from seed to sale. That's the supply architecture. And it must be done before any further consideration is given to legalization for recreational purposes.
You know, one of the things that strikes me about the medical marijuana, and I don't really want to talk about that so much, I want to talk more about recreational, but you're saying that it used to, the THC, which is the ingredient that produces the high, used to be 2 to 6%.
Correct.
Now it's 25%, and they're looking to get it up to 45%. That's about a high.
That's about a high.
Whereas the other, which is CBD,
D, cannabinoid.
which is what really we should have in the medical marijuana, because
Correct.
that stops the nausea and some of those real medicinal qualities of it. That's actually such a tiny part, and nobody's trying to grow a plant with more of the medical ingredient in it.
Right. The effort
That's
right.
Something's wrong with that.
Well, it's about money. You know, again, at the AG's conference with some representatives of the industry presenting here in Rhode Island, their whole focus was on quality control for higher concentrations of THC.
But medical is supposed to have.
But medical is the place where the benefits are to society.
Yeah.
And we're not spending our time on that. Cannabinoids are about safety. Cannabinoids are about reduced risk to the population and medical benefits, and there are very likely some that will pass FDA scrutiny. There's one right now that's being developed to treat a particularly dangerous form, a very problematic form of seizures in children. But it's at the stage of FDA approval where there are very high, 50% in some cases, effectiveness rates, but also 17 or 18% don't reduce the seizures, they increase seizures.
Yeah, more
and
work
so
needs
forth.
to be
So
done.
that's a pretty high, right, exactly. But that's a pretty high side effect rate. And, you know, what other medication would we tolerate that highest side effect rate without black box warnings?
Well, and let's not talk about medical marijuana right now, because
Okay.
it's recreational that's coming down the track. And you just talked about in the
The nuclear pot.
the nuclear pot, which is, what is that like? Is that a block? I don't
It
even
can
know what
be-
it looks like.
Well,
Is
it can be
like a
infused.
gum?
It can be honey, it's an oil. It's
A
a
butter,
concentrate,
oil,
a
okay.
butter, it can be butter. There's a number of ways to make it. Kids make it with basically a flat iron and a piece of parchment paper.
But you said there's pesticides in it, there's carcinogens in it.
It's a concentrate. So if pesticides were used and you're drawing out all of the concentrated THC, you're also concentrating at the same time other parts of the plant. So we know that there are naturally occurring fungi. Those can get concentrated. We know that there are, if you're going to use a solvent like butane or methyl alcohol, you're going to concentrate what amounts to a carcinogen. You're going to concentrate that. And of course, pesticides. If pesticides are used, then you're going to concentrate those. What are acceptable concentrations of that?
Well, I
We
mean,
don't
I
know
can
yet.
remember when we couldn't eat bacon for a while because that had carcinogens in it. So I can't imagine saying, go ahead and have this hash oil. Is that what it's called? Hash oil.
Yeah.
But so we know that there are real physical medical
Sure.
conditions that come from this. We also know that it can affect brain development.
That's correct.
We also know it can lead to addictions. It can be a gateway
Correct.
for some folks into
Correct.
higher, more
Right.
dangerous kinds of drugs.
We know
That's
that
a
we
lot
can
of
have,
stuff.
we know today with lots of research that you can have cannabis-induced sleep disorders, which are huge problems. Anybody with a sleep disorder is at very high risk for other kinds of mental health conditions. It can induce psychosis. There's cannabis-induced psychosis. There's cannabis-induced anxiety disorder, which is kind of...
Well, and motivation too.
Motivation.
I know folks who have
Right.
they get so involved
Exactly.
in just being high and floating along, purple haze, I think it's called, that they don't use their full potential. They don't get out there and
That is common when I'm sitting and talking with an adolescent, and they're very honest about it. They're very honest about it. That they no longer have the kind of motivation they used to have. We know that that there is a thing called an amotivational syndrome. We know that's connected with marijuana. We know that it not only affects motivation to do things on a daily basis, but it also affects the motivation to stop using a substance of any kind. It's really very complex. The major point that they made at the NIH is that we know very little about marijuana
So we've
compared to
just
what it is we
scratched the
don't
surface.
know. We know we need to know a whole lot more about what it does.
And because other states have already legalized it, like Colorado, what's Colorado, Oregon?
Washington, Oregon, and Alaska.
Okay, so scientists are able to go there and find a large enough samples to actually start studying it and come up with the answers that we need.
Right, and the NIH and the FDA and the federal government is making it more accessible to do that kind of thing.
Giving them permissions
right,
to do
because we still have the paradox of states approving what is on a federal level illegal. So you've got that tension between those two things.
Yeah.
And that affects a number of areas.
Well, and let me we're running out of
Sure,
time here.
sure.
I mean, so we know from what you've been telling us that there's still a lot of study that has to take place because there are dangers out there. There's medical dangers, neurological dangers, motivational dangers, addiction dangers, and we're starting to get there.
That's correct.
Studies are being done, we're starting to get there. And the only thing that I can see is what people want us, don't look at this, they want us to look at this pot of money that we can get from sales tax on recreational marijuana. To me, that's just the wrong way to look at public policy. I think we need to get all of the information and find out whether the money, and really giving government more money is never an excuse to me for making bad policy.
If I were a businessman today and I went into my boss and said, I've got a great idea, it's going to sell millions, billions. My boss is going to ask me, so let's see the cost-benefit analysis. Let's see the true costs and let's project them downstream. We haven't done that. No one that's talking about this has done that.
It yet, and we're getting there. So what's the rush? We need to take our time. We need to really get all of the information, come up with sensible regulations if we're going to do this. Not make it about the money, but make it about what's best for Rhode Islanders. So anyway, thank you for coming. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Representative.
And we'll see you all next week.
you.